a really bad computer, but I thought that I could do it, but
it's perfect. You can start anytime.
So now I have a better computer, and now I will begin to talk to you about this lecture.
Thank you.
And the lecture is about gender, sexuality, and society. And I will focus on some of the changes we see in our society regarding gender and sexuality, and how we can understand these changes in the light of the spiritual science as it is presented by Martinus. And issues of gender and society is probably relevant for most of us, and it has certainly been a predominant interest for me, both from an academic point of view, where I studied sociology many years ago, but also on a more personal level, which I will probably talk a little bit more about tomorrow in the lecture we have on identity and relationships. And I will also try and change a slide here. So when you are born into this life, you are also born into a culture where there are certain expectations concerning which path you should or should not follow in your life. And these expectations tend to form or affect our thoughts and emotions. They also form our values and also our life goals. There are certain norms in society which direct us on how we should behave and even think and feel. These norms are not always fully outspoken, but they consist of common knowledge about what is right and what is wrong. The norms are often reflected in our laws, where they become more visible to everyone. And the norms and expectations are typically cemented in traditions which function as a reminder of what is expected of you and also guide you on how you should live up to the norms. If we, for example, live in a relationship, there are certain ready-made forms in society that we are supposed to accept and conform to. The marriage, for example, has developed into a social institution that has its own laws and traditions. But the corresponding traditions apply to what men and women are expected to do with their lives. So we're not so free that we might think. And of course, there is nothing wrong with traditions. Quite the contrary. They function as a guideline for us, and they make us feel safe, and they make us feel a sense of belonging to the surrounding society or culture. But of course, it can be a problem when your inner feelings or longings does not really connect with these traditions. So, what are the expectations we often meet in our culture? Well, apart from perhaps recent years in some societies, you are normally expected to behave in a certain way if you are a man or a woman. If I would stand here in front of you as a man with a feminine dress and perhaps a makeup with an appearance as a woman, you would probably raise your eyebrow and wonder, how should I respond to this person? Can he or she be trusted? As a man, I am expected to wear certain clothes and appear in a certain way that is not associated with being a woman. And of course, it doesn't stop with appearance. As a man or a woman, you're also expected to have a certain mindset, so to speak. Certain interests and behaviors are associated with male or female behavior or interests, respectively. And you are also expected, at least until you might tell people otherwise, to be heterosexual and looking for a partner of the opposite sex with whom you can build a small family. If you, as a woman, for example, don't want children and want to pursue a career in a field where traditionally men have dominated, you might be regarded as deviant in some way. And if you want to live with a person of your own sex, or if you experience problems connected to your gender identity, you will probably be confronted with a lack of understanding from some people and even intolerant responses in society. And yet, we know that something is happening in world culture. Traditional norms are beginning to radically change when it comes to male and female behavior and connected norms. We can see women in top positions in society making a career that was in earlier days not possible. And women are, so to speak, taking up more of the public space or sphere in society compared to what we have seen in a historical perspective. In earlier days, for example, in the 1950s, women were more bound to the family or marital sphere, while men had greater opportunities to develop their interests in a certain occupational or academic field, for example. Nowadays, men are probably also taking more responsibility for the household and the children. It is also more acceptable for men to show emotions and to be vulnerable compared to what the ideal was some 50 or 60 years ago. But still, living in our society, it can be a problem for a man to be vulnerable and to show feelings, I suspect. But this, however, has not prevented the divorce rate from increasing. It seems more and more difficult to maintain a marital relationship for a whole life. And as you probably are aware of, the divorce rate is high in many countries all over the world. I have seen figures showing that almost every second marriage results in divorce. And to take an example, according to the United States National Center for Health Statistics, approximately 4 to 5 million people get married every year in the US, and approximately 42 up to 53% of those marriages eventually end in divorce. And divorce has many possible causes, of course, including infidelity, financial problems, loss of intimacy, substance abuse, domestic abuse, moral or religious differences, and simply growing apart. Whatever the reason, divorce is something that happens all over the world, and it may be every bit as universal as marriage itself. And another cultural change is, of course, the sexual revolution. Nowadays, it's not a big deal, at least in Western culture, if you engage in sexual encounters long before you get married. And it's also accepted to have had many sexual partners in your life. Sex is something that both men and women are expected to take pleasure from, and it has become separated from procreation that we heard from the lectures by Mary and Anne before. And some sociologists, for example, Anthony Giddens, he talks about a certain kind of plastic sexuality, which he calls a decentered sexuality freed from the needs of reproduction. And this plastic sexuality can be molded as a trait of personality and is connected to the person's self. And Anthony Giddens, he thinks that the emergence of this plastic sexuality is regarded as a precondition of the sexual revolution that began sometime in the 1960s. And also, during the past 50, 60 years or so, we have experienced a tremendous change in culture when it comes to what society can understand and accept in terms of different gender identities, same-sex relationships, and so forth. Of course, it also depends upon which part of the world or which culture we are talking about. In Western culture, particularly in the democratic states, Homosexuality is, for example, mainly regarded as acceptable. Not by everyone, of course, but by legal authorities and by society as a whole. You can, for example, get legally married or have your partnership registered with a same-sex person in about 30 states in 2021. And if we go back a few decades, this was totally unthinkable. Homosexuality has been punishable by law in most states in the past, and it was also regarded as a disease which you could possibly could be treated for. And even today, it is illegal in as much as 70 states all around the globe. In some states, it is prohibited by law to speak about or spread information about homosexuality or queer issues. And furthermore, gay and lesbian culture, which I use as an expression to encompass people with different kinds of gender identities and sexual orientation. This gay and lesbian culture has become more and more visible in society and integrated with the dominant culture. When I was younger, specifically in the early 1980s, and I wanted to attend a meeting place for other gay people, it was really difficult to find such a place. And of course, we didn't have internet in those days. Partly because such places were still connected to an underground culture, which I, at the time, did not have any knowledge about. And if we go further back in history, that underground culture was even more difficult to get into contact with, partly due to the stigma of being associated with something that was not accepted as normal in society. Well, now, many of you who listen probably have friends that are gay or lesbian, or someone in your close family who is gay. Of course, there is also a possibility that you define yourself as predominantly gay or bisexual. And it is a relatively new phenomenon that we can speak openly and freely about our sexual orientation in some cultures, we should add. And in this slide, I present some statistics concerning the rights for LGBTQ people in the world. And we can reflect upon that some countries still actively work against rights for these people. And as we see, of the 193 countries that are members of the UN, it is only legal to be gay in 123 countries. Some of you might think, well, that's not too bad. But what about the other countries? And what about all the people who live in those countries? And as many as 32 countries have restricted the freedom of expression of LGBTQ people. So they can't even express themselves, let alone meet with other people and make friends and develop their identity also. And 41 countries have laws that prevent the work of human rights for LGBTQ people. And only 3 countries have a ban on conversion therapy, which seeks to cure homosexuals to become healthy and heterosexual. And 73 other countries have a ban on discrimination against sexual orientation in the workplace. So that's a good thing. So we are going to a better place in society. It's going in the right direction, I think. And when it comes to transgender, I think it is still a little bit harder for those who identify themselves as transgender, which you can read about here, or intersexual, which is also a concept you use in these areas. The norms concerning male and female behavior are probably much stronger than those related to sexual orientation. And consequently, a feminine behavior in a man or a masculine behavior in a woman, regardless of their sexual orientation, is often, but not always, of course, considered as less acceptable than the expected behavior in my experience. And the norms can cause an enormously strong pressure for the deviant person to comply with the norms. And the deviant person sometimes tries to suppress feelings or behavior that in some ways are considered unacceptable. And this can, of course, lead to internal and personal problems. And these problems the person must deal with somehow. And some people deal with it in a destructive way, such as drinking alcohol or maybe engaging in sexual relations without any emotional commitment, which can probably affect the ability to form healthy relationships. And we will talk more about that tomorrow. And so just to define transgender, as it said here, if it feels like your body, your gender identity, your gender expression, your linguistic gender, and your legal gender do not match in one way or another. So it's just that you don't feel like a woman if you're a man, but it's many aspects of this that can feel wrong or different in some way. So we will now turn to Martinus. The background I have given you here is more of a kind of sociological background, but of course this is a course in Martinus' teachings, and so we must talk a little bit what he says as well, of course. So what is the cosmic background to these cultural changes according to Martinus, and what can we expect in the near future on these areas? And well, Martinus has a lot to say about this. As we have heard in our previous lectures here from Anne and Mary, the driving force behind this development is the highest fire. And the highest fire is the same as the sexual principle. And the sexual principle has two sexual poles, the feminine and the masculine, and they define a person's appearance as being a male or being a female person. And it is safe to say that all of us are beginning to become a double-poled individual where the two sexual poles are in a perfect balance. But as for now, most of us are unbalanced in that sense that one of the poles has a dominating influence on our consciousness. For most of the men, the masculine pole has a dominant influence, and for most of the women, the feminine pole has a dominant influence. And of course, this has a profound effect on our thoughts, our feelings, our needs, and how we connect to other people. And I just want to see some more text here before I continue. So here we go. And if I was a sociologist, I might say that the changes in society comes from different social structures and the norms in society and the traditions and so forth, like I told you before. But if we go to Martinus, there is something that is the driving force behind this, and the driving force is, of course, the sexual transformation, the pole transformation that we all go through. And we must understand the individuals in society and their personal development to fully understand what is going on in society. And of course, the culture plays a crucial part in these changes, as the society we live in make up the social reality in which we have our necessary experience. Martinus explains that the life we have is a consequence of how we have lived before, and we have sent out energies in life and in our relations with other people, and that energy will eventually get back to us in some way, and they form us, and they play a great part in our evolution. And when a person's sexuality or gender differs from the predominant norms in society, it is due to a personal transformation related to that person's own experiences from different lifetimes, and of course the present lifetime. And from the person's own perspective, it is quite natural for him or her to have a certain sexual orientation or a certain mental sense of gender identity. It can't be changed with therapeutic techniques or some other external influence. And it is of vital importance for the person himself or herself, as well as for the surrounding society, to understand and accept these different expressions of sexuality and gender, at least in my opinion. And Martinus explains that marriage is a cosmic principle or divine structure that has its own cycle. We were talking earlier of the great spiral cycle that we all go through to evolve into human beings, real human beings, and then we continue into the spiritual realms. But marriage has also this kind of cycle, and it begins as something that is fully compatible with the state we have in the animal kingdom. When we are one pole, we have a very suitable consciousness just for marriage. Of course, animals don't marry, but our traditions of marriage is a continuation of what we have experienced in the real animal kingdom. And marriage is a necessity in a certain path of evolution. But as you understand, we all are in a period of transition that will bring forward a much more individualistic approach to life. And this doesn't mean that our interest in other people diminishes. Quite the contrary. As we develop a real capacity or faculty for love, it becomes natural for us to express this love to more and more living beings, even for those who have the same sex as ourselves. And this is, of course, a contrast to what we associate with marital love and marriage, with its demand for fidelity and exclusivity. If our partners show too much love for another person, we tend to be jealous. And the root of this jealousy is that marriage is, at least traditionally, a commitment to one person only, based on amorous love, infatuation, and a social contract. And Martinus says that from a cosmic perspective, God uses marriage as a means for transforming the living being from a more primitive state of consciousness to a humane consciousness. As our evolution towards becoming a real and true human being, we will gradually be unsuited to be bound to another person in a marriage, he says. And we shouldn't underestimate the value of all experience we can receive in a marriage relationship. And as we can see in this quote from Martinus, it is from the article Marriage, I think the one you were discussing when I have technical problems. Marriage is one of the greatest tests for the terrestrial human beings at the moment. It is a spiritual grindstone that plays a part in grinding away the hard, sharp edges of the terrestrial human consciousness. From a purely human point of view, marriage is a sphere of activity in which someone who really wants to work on their own development has enormous possibilities to overcome much of their egoism and selfishness. And of course, that is the way to go on our path to the real human kingdom. We must get away from egoism and selfishness. And if we look at our evolution from a broader perspective, we have in our previous lives probably been engaged in numerous marriages. Most of us doesn't want to live alone, or don't want to live alone. And we certainly haven't been living alone in previous lives, I'm sure of it. And some of these marriages were happy and some of them were really challenging in different ways. And we have certainly experienced difficulties in our relationships, and for some at least also problems connected to our sexuality and gender. And when we go from life to life, we bring our experiences with us, even if we can't remember them. And yet they form our wishes and longings, they form our fears and such things that we want to avoid. And in the deepest sense, like I think it was Mary that said before, or Anne, we want to avoid unpleasant experiences such as suffering and pain, both physically and mentally. Of course, mental pain is really challenging, and we long for pleasant experiences that for us are related to safety, love, and peace. And as you might have read in the article we recommended for this course, The Marriage, Martinus brings forward the problems many of us have with staying in a marriage for a long time. As I mentioned before, we see a lot of divorces in society, and the central cause of this is, according to Martinus, the pole transformation. This phenomenon does not only change our ability to fall in love amorously in another person, but also change the foundation for our sympathetic attitude towards other living beings. And we will become more and more oriented towards what Martinus defines as neighborly love. And this is, in short, a kind of love that are associated with unselfishness and the longing just to make everything good for our fellow beings. And it is a more intellectual kind of love that, of course, also includes the longing for embracing or caressing the object for our love. And Martinus says that the sexual desire or our sexual capacity does not go away when we become more double-poled. Of course, it would be quite bad if our ability to have sex in our lifetime is much better than the one that will become later on in life. And of course, that's not the case. The sexual desire or our sexual capacity does not go away when we become more double-poled. Quite the opposite, you might say. But the sexual desire and longings transforms into something that focuses more on the other person's needs as opposed to your own needs for gratification. And we see here a symbol by Martinus, which is called the eternal present. And I will just point out some things here. We have here the living being, the I, and the superconsciousness, the creative ability and ability to experience. And we have our past marked with yellow color, and we have the future here marked with green color. So the green color can symbolizes many things in Martinus' teachings. And we see several lives here going from one to another, and they become a little bit more lighter. You see, there are many black stains here, or it is a little bit more dark in the previous lives, and it becomes more and more lighter as we go on to the future. And here we see the karmic bows that connects one life to another. Some karmic bows return in our present life, and some return in the next life. And there are karmic energies that come back to us many thousands of years into the future. But everything we send out will eventually come back to us in some kind of experience. And of course, it is the same when it comes to experiencing sexuality or experiencing feelings of a certain gender identity, or, well, including everything, of course. And we live in a transitional period. And according to Martinus, we will come to a point where the opposite sexual pole will begin to affect not only our urge to create and learn things and other specifically humane faculties, but also our sexuality and our suitability for marriage, as I said before. And Martinus writes that the opposite pole within us is responsible for every kind of sexual desire that are oriented towards persons of the same sex as our own. And he writes here in a quote I will try and put forward: as it is the continued development of the opposite pole that underlies the new state of being, the man will thus be too feminine to be attracted by a woman, and the woman too masculine to be attracted by a man. And it is this condition that shows that the marital talent ceases. But the sexual drive of these beings has not stopped and will not stop. The opposite pole in the beings is a sexual pole as well as the ordinary pole. And with the development of the opposite pole, the sexual power does not diminish, but rather increases. The being thus has a more or less prominent sexual desire. And the object of this desire is in reality neither the man nor the woman, but rather the human in the man or the human in the woman. And with human in man and human in woman, one must thus understand the developed neighborly love in these beings. And this is where the situation arises, where the being's sympathy is drawn towards beings of their own gender. Men are attracted to men and women are attracted to women. And you can read about this in The Highest Fire, the third lecture, which Martinus held in 1960. So in the future, we will all develop a double-poled body as well as our double-poled consciousness. But our consciousness is a primary thing, and the body will develop at a later stage. But during a transition period, it is natural that we experience what Martinus writes about in this quote, even if it can be really difficult to understand. And we must also understand that it is a gradual transition. So not everybody will experience this tomorrow or even in the next life. And one shouldn't try to force this feelings. If you don't have them, you should just go on living and seek out the pleasures that you long for in your life here and now. And you shouldn't try to be anything else but what you are. But of course, that is the same for those people who have feelings towards people of their own sex, or they have a certain gender identity. They must pursue what they feel inside of them. And in fact, Martinus writes about the opposite pole's true mission in this way. When a being feels sexual attraction to its own sex, it reflects the fact that its sexual pole development has reached its brain and thereby its day consciousness. In this situation, the individual, through its opposite pole, can thus begin to feel or sense very faintly sensations that were previously unconscious. when the vibrations of the opposite pole have begun to gain a foothold in the brain, it gives rise here to that which is its true mission, namely the beginnings of a corresponding sympathy for such a being's own sex. And of course, we must understand this in a much broader perspective, because the competition and the rivalry amongst people of the same sex, it has to be replaced by a new sympathetic attitude towards the former rival. We can't get peace in the world if men are competing amongst each other for the same woman, for example. It's impossible to create peace with one-pole beings, predominantly one-pole beings. They must develop into double-pole beings to be able to create peace in society. So we can see that gradually a more double-pole sexuality takes a hold of the individual, and the longing for the one-pole sexual experience diminishes. And he writes, I haven't put out the quote here, but I have summarized it in these sections there. And it is from Leavitt's book 5, section 1900. And this degeneration is sensed as a kind of sexual satiation or satiety. Don't know if I pronounce it right, but anyway. And with this satiation, the attraction towards the one-pole release decreases at the same time as the attraction towards the one-pole or so-called normal sexual act between two beings of opposite sexes is weakened or decreases. The desire, wish, or longing for a change in the sexual experience arises. The fact is that the sexual desire or longing for sexual release does not decrease, even though the sexual structure is changed. The weakening applies only to the longing or attraction towards the ordinary or thousands of years old normal act. This new attraction is thus not directed towards beings of the opposite sex. It is, as will be remembered, the desire to possess these beings that is satiated. Sorry. When the beings of the opposite sex are not the object of the new sexual attraction, only the other beings of the race or species can be. And these others can, of course, in turn be only individuals of the being's own sex. And I am about to round up this and summarize. And in my opinion, we live in a society where we have a great variety of sexual orientations and gender identities. And it is because people have had a great variety of experiences in their previous lives, sometimes combined with suffering and unhappiness, which have influenced their mental status. We cannot fully understand and see how a certain individual's previous experiences have formed his or her gender identity or sexual orientation. But we must understand that Martinus analyses are in no way intended to cause any kind of intolerance towards different lifestyles or states of consciousness. But we can use these analyses to understand ourselves and to understand different societal phenomena that occur before our eyes. And in my opinion, we are likely to see an increasing number of persons that are oriented towards sexual encounters with persons of their own sex. And we can also expect that differences between men and women will continue to diminish when it comes to preferences in life and how everyone wants to express him or herself. In our society, it is now legally and culturally acceptable to live with a person of the same sex. And you can also go through a transition from one biological sex to another. which is called a sex reassignment surgery. And as we heard earlier on by Mary, Martinus explains that we don't change biological sex from one incarnation to another. In the animal kingdom, which we still belong to, we are either a male or a female being until we become double pole. So we might presume that these operations will cease to be performed when we get a better understanding of the sexual pole transformation in society. But it will be, the future will tell. We don't know for sure. And the transformation from being a one-pole being is a gradual development where we go from being predominantly male or female to become a double pole being, where the masculine and feminine faculties are organized in a completely harmonious manner. But it is quite natural that men begin to have feelings and thoughts that traditionally are categorized as feminine, and that women also experience more masculine tendencies in their consciousness. And of course, our consciousness decides what kind of life we want to live, what our longings are, what our values are, how we feel towards other people, and so forth. And it is also understandable that this can cause confusion to some extent, even for a person that are not unbalanced or derailed in their sexuality. And we tend to define ourselves in relation to the dominating cultural norms. And when we feel that we don't seem to fit in, we might assume that there is something wrong with us. And we will talk more about that tomorrow. And I will finish now with a quote from Martinus that makes us understand that nothing can be changed overnight. And we must be tolerant towards behaviors that might seem a little immature or even derailed in comparison to the final result of the development. As long as the homosexual or the double pole being is not a finished human being, it will naturally be encumbered with vices and derailments, just like the one-pole beings. But to regard vices and derailments or other unfinished sides of the human being as belonging particularly to the double-pole human being is absolutely wrong and is in itself a derailed view. Homosexuality in its purest form is thus not any kind of vice or derailment. It is organically anchored in the double pole state and the neighborly love, and is that foundation of life without which a real world of light in its totally purest form would be an absolute impossibility. So I thank you for now.